Hi, everyone. So my name is Tarak Parekh. Thanks, David. I have been with Nutanix for a little over a year. And I am a product manager for our Manageability product called Prism. And what I was thinking of doing for the next 10 to 15 minutes is essentially lay out some context in terms of the learnings that we've had from our customers in terms of the journeys that they take from a data solution standpoint, as well as the silos that they create within their organization. I wanted to share a couple of stories that we've gone through as part of Nutanix, and maybe provide some learnings that we've had through those stories, and then end off with the key takeaway. I'm also obligated to say that I am the person between you and lunch, so we will try to. So thank you for taking the time and spending it with us, both of us. So let's start off with this. So one of the things that we've learned, at least in our interactions with the customers, is that silos of data come in 4 types. And just to give you a quick, I would say, overview of the types, you've got structural silos in your organization, which is essentially saying that each group within an organization builds a function or an application that generates a certain type of data. So what you end up doing is, and there's no incentive for these groups to actually talk with each other. So what you end up having is a lot of structural silos of data within your organization. You have political silos, essentially saying, hey, it's my data, it's valuable to me, I don't know why I should share it with you. So that's one part of the other type of silos we see. For fast-growing companies, you encounter a growth kind of silo, which essentially says that, hey, we built this application, generated this format of data, but it's not going to work in 6 months because we are evolving so fast, we're innovating so fast, so let's just dump whatever we had. But essentially, you lose out all the historical context of your data, things of that nature. So you have another growth kind of silo. And you have a vendor silo. We are 2 vendors here standing up, and I wouldn't be candid saying that we are not going to share our data with a whole bunch of other vendors. So vendors are not incentivized to actually share their data with each other. But if you look at what David just said, if you had one question to ask, if you wanted a holistic view, you would want for that data layer to be agnostic of your vendors. So that's something you need to keep in mind, I would say, when you're looking at data solutions as to which of the solutions you're working with actually helps you break down these silos that you will experience in your data journey. Again, a piece of, I would say, context setting. I don't know how many of you have seen this Gartner chart. Any of you? So this is what they call the Gartner's Analytics Ascendancy Model, big name. But essentially what it lays out is the journey that a customer could take, and like all typical charts, all good things go from bottom left to top right. Essentially the journey that a customer would take you would start off from information, the questions you want to ask of your data. But essentially, you want to get to the point where you are being prescriptive about the plan that you have around your data. And that is, you want to visualize your data, you want to analyze your data, you want to potentially predict as to what's going to happen. And more importantly, you want your data solution to be able to provide you with a prescriptive plan that will help you manage the problems that are going to occur in the future. What this is also interesting is that this particular chart can also be used to evaluate the vendors you're working with. Are your vendors that you're working with also taking the same journey? Are they a step ahead of you in terms of helping you solve the problems that you're going to be encountering, maybe not today, but in 6 months from now? The other, I would say, trend that's happening, again, I'm sure you're not strangers to this, essentially is that how consuming data has changed over a period of time, right? 30 years ago, you had these large ERP systems, compute was very expensive, you were crunching data on mainframes, so you had data moving to compute, right? 10, 15 years ago, compute became cheap, and you had this era of Hadoop kind of solutions wherein essentially, just because compute was, you took compute to the data. More recently, what we are seeing is, given the real-time insights that customers want to gather, they are moving the real-time insights that customers want to gather, as well as use cases around IoT. Customers are moving compute towards the edge, and they're looking at doing streaming analysis or streaming insights. So this is, again, this is just a set context setting in terms of what silos you can expect in your environment, as well as what kind of a journey would you be taking, or you could potentially take when you are consuming data and you're implementing data solutions. So with that, I'm going to start off with a couple of stories. I'll start off with a story which is not Nutanix, but I really liked it, so I spent some time on this. I don't know how many of you have heard the story about Morton's Steakhouse and their data, something that went viral, maybe it was 3 or 4 years ago. Yeah, okay. So here's Peter Shankman. He's an investor, VC. He's had a very long day. He's about to get onto a flight to Newark, and jokingly he tweets that, "Hey Mortons, can you meet me at Newark Airport with a porterhouse when I land in 2 hours? Okay, thanks." And he just gets off on the plane. Now what ends up happening is when he lands at Newark, there's a man in a tuxedo with a porterhouse steak in a bag waiting for him at the airport. Now think about, naturally he was a very happy man. This was, it naturally was it was a publicity stunt for Mortons, but what was important is what all the kind of data silos that Mortons went through to actually make this thing happen, right? You're looking at unstructured data from Twitter, you're looking at your customer data, you're figuring out this is a frequent tweeter, he's a frequent customer at Mortons, what kind of steak does he like, which flight is he on? So if you think at all the data that you had to comb through in 2.5 hours to deliver this customer delight is phenomenal. So I love the story about that. See, it's good because we ask ourselves this question too at Nutanix. Are we at the stage where we can deliver this level of customer delight to our customers, where we can comb through our data? And I think that's a question I think you should ask yourselves too, whether you can actually deliver to do that. Okay, on to a couple of not so interesting, but important Nutanix level stories, right? So here's we work with a large big box retailer, this guy with a yellow tag label, and they were having a challenge with meeting the infrastructure SLAs. Now it's a big retailer, sells a whole bunch of electronic products, and what they were noticing was that during Christmas time, they used to either run out of capacity, both in terms of compute and storage, or some service would go down, their website would go down, things of that nature. They were having a lot of issues with infrastructure planning for the year of shopping season. And the challenges that they were facing were that they did not have complete visibility into their infrastructure. They did not know how their VMs were being used. There were some naughty VMs which were running virus scans in their environment, but that was slowing down a whole bunch of other virtual machines. They were running out of storage, and they got to a point wherein they said, hey, for the next 6 months, which is July to December, we will not touch our infrastructure, right? Now think about that. Essentially, you're saying, I am locking down my infrastructure just for this entire time period because I do not have enough visibility. So the initial solution, what they tried to solve this problem with, was that it's spreadsheets, that did modeling, but it turned out to be super challenging. And finally, what they landed off with, it's a cool buzz thing that's going on called machine learning. They essentially, we worked with them to essentially implement a machine learning-based infrastructure analytics. So again, goes back to the point that David made. What was the question they were asking of their infrastructure? Do I have the right infrastructure laid out to be able to handle seasonal variations in my application and my customers? Do I have enough capacity? Do I have enough compute power? Will I not go down? Right? I know those are 4 questions. That's not one. But the idea is, once they figured out that that is the question that they want to have answered, we actually worked with them to essentially build out an analytics plane, so to say. That brings me to my quote-unquote first learning that we had through this story. I'm sure you've seen this particular, pipeline, data pipeline in a bunch of these sessions. So I'm not going to go over it. It's collection and modeling, analysis, and all of that. And what was important was that to get that level of visibility into the infrastructure that this particular retailer had, was that they had to start looking at building an analytics plane for their particular organization. Now, this particular analytics plane was served to solve a specific use case. Am I meeting my infrastructure SLAs? That's the question that they were asking. So to that, what they did was we worked with them to build this analytics plane, which allowed them to collect information of all the various components in the system so that they could get complete visibility into their system. So that's what they did. That's what they started off with. But what we did also is they also decided to move on to implement this machine learning algorithm on top of it. It was not just enough to get visibility into your infrastructure or into your data. It was important that they are able to predict forward and be able to plan for any seasonal variations, things of that nature in their particular environment. So they added a machine learning algorithm on that. And basically, they started off with a visualization use case and did analysis, but more importantly, got to a point where now they're able to predict the capacity that they would need to serve the busy Thanksgiving and Christmas season, and they're in a better state. And now they don't have the lockdown saying we will not upgrade our infrastructure in the 6 months. So essentially, again, I'm going to go back to David's point. Essentially, you identify, what's important here is you identify the question that you're trying to answer, and you build a plane or start implementing an analytics plane in your organization to serve that specific use case or the question you're trying to answer. And most of the customers that we've seen, they run the gamut in terms of their DIYers, right? They'll build their own pipelines around Spark and Kafka and Redshift and things of that nature. And they're customers who want completely prepackaged solutions. So it's important that you understand where your competency lies and do you have that right team, the right skill set to actually build that analytics pipeline. Right? Start off from that specific use case and then start building that analytics pipeline or the plane, which should help you break down the silos and helps answer that question that you're seeking to ask of your environment. So that's the first story. The second, somewhat related story, so we have this company called Nasdaq, right? A stock exchange. They had a challenge where they wanted to get a centralized logging mechanism in their environment. And the reason why they needed that was, again, a simple use case of visibility, but more important, it was more around security and compliance. Right? They wanted to ensure that various groups in their organization are not installing weird applications, everything is in compliance. It was important, very important for them. So they had all these silos of logs, infrastructure logs, application logs, security logs. What are they going to do? So what they attempted to do, at least for the initial solution, was they tried to do this in-house. Now this is Nasdaq. It's almost like an electronic tech company, right? I mean, it's tech exchange. They tried to build this in-house, but they were not successful because of the operational challenge. I mean, it was difficult to maintain, develop, and to get everybody on board. It just didn't work out for them. So what they ended up settling on is they settled on implementing Splunk in the environment. Now you could look at Splunk as potentially the analytics plane that I just talked about, right? This is the analytics plane that you start off with by aggregating logs and information from various silos. And we at least start building out the visibility use case. You can now query your logs for various things. The reason why they liked Splunk a lot was it was easy to deploy, it was ease of management, but the security team, the one that had the most trouble within the environment, they really liked Splunk because they were able to do the security correlations in their data. So they went ahead and implemented Splunk. But what was the learning here? One of the things they figured out was the infrastructure at this point became very important. And the reason is, before we worked with them, essentially they had maybe 5-6 flavors of operating systems running in their environment. They had 4 or 5 flavors of hypervisors running in their environment, a bunch of storage, bunch of filers. So it was very, very heterogeneous. So what they realized is, as soon as they implemented Splunk, one thing they realized, one thing I think we've also learned working with customers is, as soon as the analytics solution is done right and people see the value of it, you instantly see hockey stick growth. Everybody wants to use it. Until it doesn't, if it doesn't work, nobody cares. But as soon as people see the value, everybody wants to use it. And that's where infrastructure became very important. Now, do you have, or were they working with the right vendor where they were able to easily scale out, extend the infrastructure, is what they realized that they needed to do. So that was their learning. The key thing here, essentially, again, is from the story of Nasdaq was that you have to select the right infrastructure for your use case. So you have your standard infrastructure requirements, right? You need to be able to access the data. You have to have the right speed, the availability, all of that. Because if you want your data to be available and your insights to be available, you need your infrastructure to work right. You need to consider the hockey stick consumption. Once the analytics solution is delivered right, you have the right value. You have to ensure that your infrastructure is able to take care of it. There are hybrid considerations. So one of the things that we learned with our interaction with Nasdaq was, Splunk liked to do a lot of tiering of data, wherein you couldn't keep all of the expensive logs on expensive tier of storage, but they needed a way to tier off the data in the environment. So they were looking at how they could potentially use public cloud to actually tier off their cheap data outside. But the most important thing was, yes, infrastructure is important, but it really should not matter to you, right? One of my colleagues says that, remember, this is a data center. It's not an infrastructure center. It's not a compute center. So with your teams, what you need to do is to be able to focus on data. You shouldn't have to worry about the infrastructure. So that was the other key thing. One of the things, I think this is by Vicky Bond. One of the constant things we've heard from our customers is the number of admins that are required to manage a Hadoop cluster, for example. So look at that. Means if you have greater than 2 Hadoop clusters, you require 1.4 admins per Hadoop cluster. That's a huge operational cost. And that sometimes becomes the friction to to invest in these data solutions. So let me wrap up with this. So essentially, that's 2 key learnings that we had. One is that, again, leveraging what David said, figure out the right question that you want to ask of your data, find that objective, and start building the analytics plane that will help you solve that problem. That analytics plane will also help you build a solution that will help you break down silos. Second is, infrastructure is going to matter. You want to be working with vendors in general that are going to help you in that Gartner journey that we laid out, right? Or is your vendor ahead by one step as to the problems that you're going to face? So you have to ask your vendor, hey, how are you using your data? Are you going to help me make my life easier, better, all things that. So that's it. Thank you so much for the time. David, any closing comments?
Well, I guess before we go into closing comments, any questions? I mean, we covered a lot of ground here pretty quickly. And actually, I have a question for you before we break too. But any questions so far? It was all self-evident. That's wonderful. Well, I was thinking about your examples. And I have an answer to the question myself, but I wanted to ask you as well. In terms of when working with Nasdaq or working with your yellow tagged electronics provider, did they have to invest in something? Because when I think about Hadoop or Green Plum or these big, big data engines, which are absolutely fantastic, but when I think about the typical consumer of IT, who are looking to get empowered here today, that's a project that's well beyond, I think, what a lot of people want to tackle. What kind of tools do you see them using? Because Splunk isn't necessarily that big a tool. That's shrink wrap. That's relatively straightforward. Sure. What other tools have you seen out there?
What other tools?
Or just have you seen them have to go to something like Hadoop to get the results that you're talking about?
No. So I mean, again, it goes back to the use case that you want to actually deliver, right? If it's just plain visibility, then a lot of our customers are very happy with shrink wrap software. They'll go ahead and do that yourself. But we do have some customers who are going ahead and implementing the entire analytics pipeline on top of our platform. So they'll have the Spark, Kafka, the entire pipeline built on top of Nutanix. But these are companies who are far advanced, and they have a really mature technology team, developer team inside who can help manage that. you do get a lot of customization, control, and community support with these kind of quote-unquote open source frameworks. But in most cases, the initial use cases that we've seen that people use our platform for, or in general to solve their use cases, to start off with a shrink wrap software,
Right.
but eventually figure out that, hey, maybe that's not as customizable or it's too expensive. And then they start peeling out pieces of that solution and start implementing their own plane.
Well, because you mentioned Nasdaq, who does know what they're doing. I mean, and they had a failed project along the same lines before they kind of took a step back.
No, that's very true. This is not a Nutanix story. It's a story from my previous. Even a company out of Cupertino, which has a fruit in their symbol, also uses Splunk, right?
Sure.
Now think about that company, which actually is investing probably $1 billion in infrastructure every year. Even that company went to shrink wrap software in terms of analytics and logging. So again, figuring out what your competencies are within the organization and where you really want to invest really drives where customers land in terms of investments.
Right, and I think that's the point I wanted to double down before we finished up on was we're not talking about multi-million-dollar investments, right? In some cases, maybe we're just taking analytics off of infrastructure you already own and looking at it a different way. In my use cases, we had somebody using a backup report. We had somebody who was doing content indexing of their backups. And in the third use case, it was comparing information that we were collecting and indexing off of a couple backup streams. So these are tools that you already own. Now maybe the tool you have doesn't provide those analytics, so maybe you've got the wrong solution, but you're making investments in the technologies we're talking about. Maybe it's time to take a step back and say, well, is this the right tool? Is it providing me the right insight? Because you are investing in infrastructure, you are investing in backup and probably archive and dozens of other tools that is in an industry that is evolving at breakneck speed. So the question now becomes, what are the investments I'm doing delivering back to the business in terms of insight and results? Because again, coming from a software company, if we're not providing value back to our customers each and every year, they're certainly not going to want to keep up with their maintenance payments any longer than they can possibly stand it, right? So we need to evolve, and it's not about faster or supporting more platforms in our world. And I don't mean to speak for you, but it's well past what can we do from a speeds and feeds perspective, but more how closely is our solution aligning to whatever that business or whatever that group is trying to accomplish. Because if we can't provide insight, we're at a loss. And so, not to turn this into a Nutanix or a Commvault commercial or even Splunk, they got more time than anybody here today. But think about the tools you're using. And again, if you come up with the right question, right, this is as much a story about the questions you ask than the technology used to solve them. If you start coming up with questions, that's the time to start talking to your partner like an E+ or an SHI or whoever you're using to bring value into your business and as a partner to you. Are we using the right tools? Because chances are you'll not end up spending any more money than you are today, but you'll have much more insight to what you're trying to accomplish. Okay, so I'll step off my soapbox for a second. Now, any other questions in terms of thoughts? Anything else? All right, great. Any closing comments?
Yeah, so one more color. I just want to double down on that, the question to be asked too, right? We do encounter a lot of customers who come in and say, hey, we've implemented Hadoop, now what problem can we solve? We implemented Spark, now what problem can we solve? Don't start from the technology, don't start from the tool. To your point again, figure out the question you want to ask, figure out your objective, and then build out what would help solve that problem. So that's it.
All right,
Yeah,
so my final comment, you'll be surprised at how much the companies you're already using can do for you today. So please start having those conversations now. And again, often at a similar or reduced cost than you're spending today. So be a little bold, ask a question nobody should ask. If I looked at all my data, if I had a piece of information that was going to change how we went to business, what would that piece of data be? It's when you start asking those questions to a lot of people inside your organization, because you never know where the next great idea is going to come from, and that's what IT is all about, is realizing what we use our data for to, again, help our mission achieve success. And with that, I guess we will get you to lunch on time. I think we got 5 more minutes. So thanks for showing up. Please come up and ask us any questions if you'd like. And then we have our better halves in the back of the room if you'd like to talk to somebody local. Or actually, you are local, but I'm from Denver. So happy to help out any way I can. These are the conversations I live for. So thanks for coming.
Great. Thank you so much.